Welcome to TORAH Talk. I am your host, Wil'Liam Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 60, where Rabbi cross-examines the New Testament. Tonight we will be covering Acts chapter 27. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Rabbi, for tuning in. I find it quite difficult to learn if you had not. Dry humor is what we need for an episode like tonight.
Oh, you noticed, right?
Yeah, only no one else will really catch on to that until later. So that's okay. That's okay. We forgive you.
Well, I thought it was like a cross between Gilligan's Island and Sloop John B. But it is interesting that supposedly this chapter of Acts, chapter 27, is one of the, they say, one of the finest descriptions of sea voyage, that we have in a historical document going back that far.
Wow.
But, for a rabbi cross-examining the New Testament, doesn't hold a lot of interest for me.
So we might come up with a different result tonight.
Well, there's not much for me to say, actually. I'm not going to critique their sailing prowess, and but it is an interesting read in terms of that.
Sure.
So yeah, we saw that Paul's been in a heap of trouble for the last few chapters. He's found himself defending himself in front of 4 or 5 different groups of people, leaders and kings and Jewish courts and Jewish mobs. He's really having a rough ride. And what happened in chapter 26 we saw was that he appealed to be tried by the Caesar, by the king, not just the king of the Jews in Judea, but the king of the Roman Empire, the big honcho, the big kahuna. So that's what happens now. In chapter 27, they have to take Paul all the way to Rome to meet with the Caesar. And so basically this chapter is describing the sea voyage that they take. And as I mentioned, in terms of analyzing this from a Jewish perspective, there's not really much to share. What is interesting is that you have Luke joining again in the narrative. We saw that in the book of Acts, especially when you get to the story of Paul. Luke keeps on popping in and out of the narratives, and I think the last time we saw him was back in chapter 21, and he's been absent now. It's not really clear to me. It's hard to understand if this is just a literary device where Luke keeps on popping in and out of the narrative. He includes himself here. This is what happened to us. We set to stale, he says. So he's not describing, third person what happened to Paul here. He's including himself in the narrative. So it's not clear to me if this is just a literary device or if Paul is actually, popping in and out of these stories as if he's here one day and not there the other day. The NLT Study Bible says something interesting. It suggests that during the 2 years that Paul was being held in prison, Luke was doing research for compiling his own gospel. We know that Luke was one of the 4 gospels. So, there was a long stretch of time we saw earlier when Paul was thrown into prison. And that's, according to the NLT Study Bible, that's why Luke just took off. And it isn't really in the story so much,
right?
Because he was getting. Now they say in some of the sources that I've studied that this chapter takes place around the year 59 of the Common Era. Now, again, one of the things scholars discuss, and I don't really have the expertise to weigh in on this, but most modern scholars seem to say that Luke's gospel was composed around the year 80 or 90 approximately. And they suggest that it's quite possible that his narrative in the book of Acts, his account in the book of Acts, also really is at that time. So it seems that it's interesting. In that case, the book of Acts would be composed, let's say, approximately 20 or so years, 20, 25 to 30 years after the stories take place, which seems strange to me. Why would he wait so long? And the gospel, which is one of the reasons why, many people suggest that, the Luke that is writing the gospel was not around at the time the gospel stories took place, because, the 3 years of the ministry of Jesus take place approximately 3 years around the year, let's say 30, when Jesus is crucified. And if he's writing the Gospel of Luke around the year 80 or 90, that's 50 or 60 years after the story takes place. So that would be impossible to understand why there's such a gap in years. But I'm not going to weigh in on that. That's not my problem. That's someone else's problem.
Right. Right.
So the first thing I wanted to really focus in on, I found something really strange. I thought I'd bring this up, is that when you get to verse 9, we're told that
In 28?
it was, yeah, here in
Okay.
chapter 27,
27. That's right. I scrolled too far.
right?
Sorry. Yep. I'm getting ahead of myself.
You're jumping the gun. You're
Yeah.
jumping.
Antsy.
So, yeah, they're sailing for a while, and of course, Paul is essentially a prisoner, and he's with a whole bunch of other prisoners who are being taken on this journey. So that you can imagine this ship that they're on has guards, and it has prisoners, and they're sailing for a while. And then we're told in verse 9 that when they're sailing for a while, it became very dangerous because the fast was already over. And so Paul advises them, look, this is going to be a bad trip. He says it's going to end in disaster. So he essentially is advising them not to continue. The question is, when it says the fast was already over, what is it referring to? What fast is it referring to? So just about all the commentaries that I've seen maintain that this is referring to the fast of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which takes place normally in the Jewish calendar between approximately mid-September to mid-October, give or take. And the reason you have that span of about a month during which Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, can fall, is because, as we know, the Jewish calendar is made up of it's both a lunar and a solar calendar. So the months in the Jewish calendar, in the biblical Jewish calendar, as we know from the book of Exodus, Moses is told to proclaim the new moon based upon the sighting of the moon. And so at some level, the calendar is lunar. It's a lunar calendar. And in a lunar calendar, the months are between 29 and 30 days long. And the biblical holidays are always determined by the date during the lunar month. So, for example, Passover is on the 15th day of the first month. What is called Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, in the Bible, it's called Yom Teruah, the day of the blasting of the shofar. So that's on the first day of the 7th month. And we know that Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is on the 10th day of the 7th month. And so the calendar is basically lunar. Now, the lunar calendar during the course of a year, a solar year, the lunar calendar has 254 days. And we know that a solar year has 365 and 1/4 days. So you have basically an 11-day gap, 11-day difference between a lunar year and a solar year. And so what happens is, if you stick with the lunar calendar, you have 11 days that are lost each year, in a solar year. And that would mean that in 3 years, you'd have about 33, or a month. A month is basically lost every 3 years. You'd have every 9 years, 3 months lost. And so what you'd see happening is if there wasn't any adjustments made, the the holidays in the Jewish calendar would begin slipping further and further behind during our solar year, and it would be very similar to what happens in the Islamic calendar. In Islam, they have a strictly a calendar which is only lunar, and their holidays essentially move around the year from year to year. So they'll have Ramadan sometimes in the fall, sometimes in the winter, sometimes in the spring, sometimes in the summer, and they don't make any correction for that. The Jewish Bible, God told us that Passover is supposed to be in the spring. So if you want to make sure that Passover stays in the spring and doesn't migrate towards the fall or the winter or the summer, so what we have to do is we have to add uh, basically a leap month. So really, once every 3 years or so, we add an additional month to the Hebrew calendar to make sure that the lunar and the solar calendars are pretty much in sync. But that discrepancy is what causes the holiday to slide a little bit. So you can have Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, falling out approximately the mid-September to mid-October. And what apparently we're told here is that sailing after this was dangerous. So that's I guess the technical part of this passage. But what I found really fascinating was the comment made by David Stern in his commentary to the New Testament, and he's coming from a Messianic Jewish point of view. So I'm going to read you what David Stern says, and when I read this, I fell out of my chair. So again, he's going on this phrase which speaks about, and they were sailing because the fast was already over. There's a mention that Yom Kippur had passed. So, are you having a hard time hearing me?
No, you're doing good. You're doing fine.
Okay, because I'm hearing like the Twilight Zone on my end sometimes.
Like you're alone in the room.
I'm trying to keep a straight poker face here.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, we're good. We're good. Go right ahead.
Okay. So David Stern says, this is evidence that Saul, he keeps on calling Paul Saul, but this is evidence that Saul or Paul continued observing Jewish practices, keeping the law until the end of his life. So I was asking myself, really? This fact that Luke mentions that they were sailing after Yom Kippur, that's proof that Paul was still observing the Jewish holidays and he kept on doing that until the end of his life. I mean, if that's evidence, then what you see from this is how desperate David Stern is to keep Paul within the fold. I think that as we'll see when we get to the book of Romans soon and Galatians, I think it's very hard to make the case that Paul remained Torah observant. And I've tried to show in the book of Acts that already, his colleagues back in Jerusalem, like James and Peter and John and the whole crew, they certainly seem suspicious of whether he is Torah observant. And I think that all the historical evidence, especially what we have from the 2nd century where the Ebionites and the Nazarenes they accuse Paul of being a heretic from keeping the Torah. So here, if David Stern has to use this as evidence, he calls this evidence that Paul continued observing Jewish practices, keeping the law until the end of his life. I think he's on very shaky ground. This is, to me, far from evidence. Do you think so?
I think so too. I mean, well, see, I was, how I was before. Before I was very locked and dead set on Paul being a Torah keeper. And I've seen a lot of stuff throughout the New Testament, but as we're going through one verse at a time, you're kind of spoiling my parade. I really had this all figured out. So, and apparently, there's just a lot of things that are still there that are easy to overlook, that you seem to be digging out of the haystack, which is very important stuff that I've just never thought of before. So, I'm kind of
Yeah, and again, you know what? I want to emphasize that I'm not claiming to have, as David Stern says, I don't know if I have evidence that Paul was not Torah observant. I just think that it's a hard case to make, and I think that, a lot of indications are that he isn't. But if this is all the evidence you have, then I think this is really bad news.
maybe the only thing he was trying to push was because he didn't sail on the Day of Atonement, he waited. But then again, that's
Um,
kind of weak too. That's almost like saying something like Moses drank water, Paul drank water. Hello, can't you see the connection? I saw a post
but
on Facebook like that, so it's kind of redundantly not necessarily so important to point out certain points that really may or may not connect.
no, I think here actually, unless I'm misreading it, I think they were sailing on Yom Kippur,
What
right? It says they
verse
had
is
been
that at?
in verse 9,
9? No,
right?
which time
Much
is what it
time
is.
had been spent,
Right?
and I think I'm using New King James Version here.
Okay.
So they were sailing for a while, and the sailing now became dangerous because the fast was already over, meaning they had been sailing. Now Yom Kippur was passed, and now Paul's saying, "Look, guys, I think we got to, you know, rethink this because after Yom Kippur, it's becoming dangerous to travel." Um, Apparently, that was those are the conditions of the sail of the journey back then. This would have been a bad time to travel. Now, the truth is that if you get on the ship before Yom Kippur, there's no problem with sailing on Yom Kippur. That's not a violation of Yom Kippur. It's not the best place to be
Right.
for
Okay.
the atonement, but yeah, that wouldn't be the problem. The problem is that Luke here is just simply mentioning that this was the date, and you have to realize that back then they didn't have um, other points of reference that were so easy to refer to. The fact that he mentions that it happened to have been Yom Kippur doesn't prove they were observing it. It would have been easier, had this. I mean, they could have spent time here showing exactly what Paul did on, Yom Kippur. It could have said that he actually fasted. It doesn't say he actually fasted. It says it was that was the day of the fast. Um, So, you could say that it implies that Paul fasted because it's saying the fast was over,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe that implies that Paul was fasting. But again, there's more to Yom Kippur than just fasting. Um, but I think that it's far from what I would say is proof. I don't think this really proves anything, and it certainly doesn't prove anything about other things that the Torah required. Um, so they maintain their journey. They ignore Paul's warnings, and it's to their peril. I mean, it becomes, a very, very rocky trip. I just want to point out, this is not a major point, that in verse 20, actually it happens twice in this chapter. So it says in verse 20, "Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up." So I've mentioned this before, I think several times in the book of Matthew when we studied it, that here the uh, the Christian scriptures are using the word saved or salvation in a way that's more consistent with the way it's used in the Hebrew Bible than the way it's used in you know uh, well, let's say in Christian theology, right? We know that in Christian theology, um, salvation refers to forgiveness for sins. That's why in Matthew chapter 1, verse 21, they say Jesus is named Yeshua, which is the Hebrew word for salvation. It says, because he will save his people from their sins.
Right.
And that really is the way Christianity normally sees the word salvation or to be saved. Um, they don't think of it normally as being rescued from physical danger, which is the way the word, uh, is understood in the Hebrew scriptures. But you see here that that's exactly the way Luke uses the word here. Really, it's more consistent here with a more Jewish understanding of the word salvation or saved,
Right.
not so much with a Christian understanding. So moving along, I think they're feeling that they're in a heap of trouble. And Paul now begins to reassure them that they are going to be okay. Because Paul says, beginning with verse 22 and 23, that an angel of God came to him, basically assuring him that they were going to be okay. They're going to make it to Rome. The is going to end up okay. And so what Paul says here is that an angel of God spoke to him, and the angel revealed that God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, in verse 25, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was that he told me. Now, why do I point this out? Because when Paul says here that an angel of God came to him, I don't think that he's implying that this God that spoke to him here through the angel was Jesus. Meaning
Okay.
that this has been a question we've explored a little bit all along. Did Paul equate Jesus with God? From Paul's perspective, was Jesus God? And it seems to me, at least, that he's really just speaking here about God, let's say in the Old Testament sense of the word, the creator. And he's not implying that this is Jesus speaking to him or Jesus assuring him. One of the reasons I say this is because, we always see God having angels. We don't really usually see Jesus having angels, or the expression in the New Testament, the angel of Jesus. What's interesting is that in the Hebrew scriptures, when it speaks about the angel of the Lord, Christians have traditionally insisted that that was referring to Jesus, which is fascinating. That throughout the Hebrew scriptures, when it uses that expression, the angel of the Lord, that's taken to be a reference to Jesus. But here it speaks about an angel of God, angel of the God. Um, I don't think any Christians would say that that's referring to Jesus. So I think it's interesting how the identification of the angel of God seems to switch
Mm-hmm.
between the Hebrew Bible and the Greek scriptures. Um, so that's not such an incredibly significant point, but I just thought it as a point of interest. And believe it or not, the last thing I wanted to share on this chapter was, again, a minor point as far as the chapter goes. If you swing over to verse 35, um, so here they talk about finally having some food. And we're told when they had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. So it's interesting that the way I think it's translated in almost every Christian Bible I looked at, it speaks about giving thanks to God and then breaking the bread and eating it. Now, it
Which
just sounds
is
strange.
kind of reversed, right? I mean, based on the way Torah teaches that concept. Am I correct?
Not just the Torah, but I mean, normally when we
Right.
think about things, right, you thank afterwards,
Right.
meaning that
Right.
what you would do beforehand is ask permission, please.
Mm.
Right? I learned that as a kid, please, and then thank you.
Right. 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 Right.
So here it seems to speak about giving thanks to God before he begins to eat. Now, it could be that that's just,
Courtesy.
uh, or just maybe it's a way of maybe it literally doesn't mean thanks, but blessing God for the food. So it's not really clear to me. I don't know the Greek here, but you're right that biblically we know that in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 10, So that's the source in the Bible for what we call the Birkat Hamazon, or the grace after meals, because there it speaks about you eating and then being satiated and then blessing God for the food that we've eaten.
Right.
So that would be basically the Bible's requirement to thank God for having, uh, been satiated with His food, with His bounty. Um, so again, Deuteronomy 8:10 speaks about blessing God for food after we've eaten the food. There's really no source in Scripture for blessing God before we eat the food. Now, how did that get derived? And by the way, that's a rabbinic practice. I mean, it was the rabbis who uh, deduced that we should um, basically bless God for the food before we eat it, which is basically not thanking God for the food, but it's asking permission. Please. Now, why do we say that we're asking permission? So if you go to the Talmud in Tractate Brachot 35a, this is the first tractate of the Talmud. So the rabbis there find a contradiction between two verses in the book of Psalms. They say that you have a verse in the 24th chapter of Psalms, verse 1, which says, Lashem haaretz umaloa, to the Almighty belongs the earth and everything in it. So there you have a verse which says that the earth and everything in it belongs to God, which, by the way, makes perfect sense because since God is the creator, it belongs to him. That's a no-brainer. Usually, if you make something, you own it. If you break it, you've got to pay for it.
That's funny.
So the rabbis say that's true in that verse where it says that the earth and all of its contents belong to God. But if you swing over to Psalm 115, verse 16, so there it says, Hashemayim shamayim ladonai, v'haaretz natan livnei adam. So there it says, the heavens are heavens to the Lord, to the Almighty, but the earth he has given to human beings. So the rabbis in Tractate Brachot 35a say there seems to be a contradiction. One verse from Psalm 24:1 says that the earth and everything in it belongs to God, but the other verse in Psalm 115, verse 16, says that no, God has given the earth to human beings. So it doesn't belong to him at that point. It now belongs to human beings. So how do you resolve this seeming contradiction between these verses? So the sages say that one verse is describing the state of the food, of the state of the produce before you've made a blessing, and the other verse is describing the situation after you've recited a blessing, meaning that before you recite the blessing that comes before the eating of food, before you recite that blessing, the earth does belong to God. He's the creator, it belongs to him. And when the verse speaks about, but God has given it to human beings, that's referring to after you've asked permission by reciting a blessing before eating the food. So that becomes a rabbinic requirement to say a blessing before we eat food. And biblically, in Deuteronomy 8:10, we see there's a requirement to thank God after we've eaten and have become satiated.
Nice.
And that's basically, all the stuff that I wanted to share because I don't really know much about sailing.
Right.
I, I'm a New Yorker, and even though a lot of New Yorkers sail, we didn't do too much sailing.
That's funny.
So it's an interesting travel chapter, but I'm only interested in examining this from a rabbinical point of view. Um, Next week we have the last chapter in Acts, which is the grand finale, the grand conclusion, and that's going to have a lot of action for us.
I am looking forward to it. Yep. So we've got one more chapter, and we can move on. And so Romans is just going to be Interesting. Of course.
Oh yeah, that's going to be juicy.
Yeah, and we're almost there, so don't go anywhere. If you started this, we're going to be around for a while. This is I was telling Rabbi tonight was episode number 60, as you can see on the screen up there. And and it may take us a while, but when you zoom in really, really close like this, it takes a while to pick through everything. So that's what we want to do. We want to get in there and find out everything we can. So, Rabbi, you did a great job as usual. So good to see you again. So good to see all the people watching out there.
Friend.
You betcha. Shalom, everybody. Shavua Tov to you, Rabbi, and to all you viewers. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Same place. See you later. Bye, Rabbi.